Good morning, and welcome to the first of a two-part program on Walt Disney of Kansas City. I'm Stacia Schaefer of the State Historical Society of Missouri. With us today is Disney historian Dan Viets. Today's webinar is possible due to our donors and members of the State Historical Society. Please visit shsmo.org/join to renew or become a member, and thank you for supporting the work we do to preserve and share Missouri history. Dan Viets is co-author of the book, Walt Disney's Missouri, The Roots of a Creative Genius, published by the Kansas City Star. Dan has written articles for several magazines, including Missouri Life, Gateway Heritage, and Jackson County Historical Society. He is credited by the authors of half a dozen Disney biographies with assisting them in their research. Dan is president of the not-for-profit organization Thank You Walt Disney Incorporated, which owns and is preserving and restoring the building in Kansas City, which housed Disney's first professional film studio, Laugh-O-Gram. It is the location where Disney made some of his earliest animated and live action films. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Stacia, very much. This is the first time I've presented a webinar, so I hope you'll bear with me. I hope I can effectively use this medium to share some information with you about a person I believe to be one of the most fascinating individuals that ever came out of the state of Missouri. I did indeed have the opportunity to work on the book whose cover you see before you now, published almost 25 years ago. Worked with Brian Burns, who's the Kansas City Star's history writer, and Bob Butler, who was then the movie editor at the Star. And we all coordinated our efforts and worked under an editor who did a great job of laying this book out. And it's been out of print for many years now. I have some copies available, and you can find them online occasionally. But I am proud of this work, and I think it's probably the most detailed and thorough examination of the 15 years that Walt Disney spent growing up and living and working in Missouri. Now, most Disney fans know that he spent a very important period of his early years in Marceline, Missouri. And Marceline, Missouri is justly proud of its connections with Walt Disney. It served as the inspiration for many of Walt's early films and the design of the Main Street area of Disneyland and the Disneyland-style theme parks at other locations around the globe: Florida, Tokyo, Paris, Beijing, the Disney empire. One could say the sun never sets on the Disney empire. But Little Marceline, Missouri is indeed the model for the Main Street area of that park. In many ways, the Disneyland parks are autobiographical. They incorporate aspects of Walt's life in them. Now, when we set about to create the book you see before you, one of the discoveries that Brian Burns made actually was over at the UMKC library, a collection of photographs by an Armenian photographer whose name was Baron Masakian. And Baron shared offices, or had offices, I should say, in the same building just down the hall from Walt's Laugh-O-Gram studio. So the two images you see on the cover here illustrate Walt Disney before Mickey and Walt Disney after Mickey. Approximately 1921, the photograph on the left, and approximately 1931 was the image on the right. And although they look very different at first glance, in fact, the expressions that Walt has in these two images are virtually identical. On the left, I think he was trying to evoke his image of what a Hollywood director should look like, and he was probably already thinking about moving out to Hollywood at that point. And again, on the right, you see a successful studio head, the owner of what was actually a very small studio, but it punched above its weight. It was very effective. Walt was very effective in using his small studio and his small staff to tell stories and to establish his reputation. Along with Mickey, that is, Walt actually served as the voice of Mickey Mouse. And one reason Mickey became immediately popular is because it was the first successful example of sound and with animation. Um, Sound was very primitive when films began to first use sound, and it was difficult to locate the microphone where it would be able to pick up the speech of the actors and so forth. But in animation, Walt had complete control of the technology. So the sound effects, the dialogue were actually better on animated films, on Walt's animated films at least, than they were in live action films in many ways. Now, this is the earliest known image of Walt Disney. He was born on December the 5th, 1901, first year of the 20th century, in Chicago, Illinois. And when he was approximately 5 years old, 4 years old, actually, his parents decided to move. They thought the neighborhood was getting kind of rough and crime ridden. And Walt's father, Elias, his brother Robert, owned some farmland near the town of Marceline, Missouri, which was on the main line of the Santa Fe Railway. And so the family moved to Marceline when Walt was 4 years old. This is the house where Walt was born, in Chicago at 1249 Tripp Avenue. Now, the houses have been renumbered since then, but this house still stands and has recently been restored, and it's open occasionally to the public. It's wonderful that this house has been preserved. It has so many important historical connections to Disney. Not only was Walt born there, but so was his older brother Roy, and his older brother Herbert, I believe, was also born in this house, and his little sister Ruth, just 2 years younger than Walt. And this house was built by his father, Elias Disney, who worked as a contractor, who worked on the Chicago World's Fair. In fact, that's why his parents had moved to Chicago, so that Elias could work on the construction for the Chicago World's Fair. And the house was designed by his mother, Flora Disney. So it represents a collaborative effort between his parents. His father also built a congregational church, which still stands in the neighborhood, and at least one other house which resembles this one. Now, again, in April of 1906, when Walt was 4 years old, his family moved to Marceline, Missouri, and arrived on a train that looked very much like this one. You see a young man on the left-hand side here standing in front of the train, so I hope the train is stationary at this point. This is one of the images that the Walt Disney Company paid me to use. I told them I don't own the rights to this card. I just have an example of this card. But the company was preparing a special exhibit about Walt's life to be constructed at Walt Disney World in the Hollywood theme park down there. And they saw this image and another one of Marceline's Main Street in our book. And so they contacted me back in about 1999 and insisted that they wanted to pay me for the rights to use these cards. And I reluctantly accepted their money. It was nice to have the money flow to me instead of to the Disney company as it had for decades before and since. And occasionally they expected that exhibit to last only about a year and a half for Walt's 100th birthday. But in fact, it's still there today, 25 years later. And it's a great little exhibit. If you're in Walt Disney World, I highly recommend that you seek this out. It's again in the Hollywood theme park behind the Little Mermaid show. But this is a great image. The Santa Fe Railway created Marceline in 1888. They extended their line from Kansas City north to Chicago. And if there wasn't a town every 100 miles, they created one because steam engines needed to take on water and coal and sand. Sand is also an essential part of a steam engine's operation because they need to get traction. So there are little sand bells on top of the engine, and the engineer can release a little bit of sand under the wheels to get them started. The building on the right-hand side here in the foreground, the lunchroom, is a Fred Harvey lunchroom. Most of the Fred Harvey restaurants were larger and more elaborate, and some of them were connected with Fred Harvey hotels. But this little lunchroom still stands in Marceline today. It's currently used as a railroad museum. The building to the left of that one, the original Santa Fe station, no longer stands. But in the foreground, to the right of where the lunchroom is a beautiful new, well, relatively new Santa Fe train station that was beginning to be built while the Disney family still lived in Marceline. This is the main street of Marceline. This is the main street that inspired the creation of the Main Street section of Disneyland and the other Disneyland style theme parks around the world. This is another one of the cards that the company used, and they blew these up to 4 by 6 feet, and they used them in multiple locations in that exhibit about Walt's life down at Walt Disney World in Florida. I've collected a lot of photographs in addition to a lot of postcards from the era of Walt's early life. And this is a relatively recent acquisition. You can see at the bottom the embossed name Nickel. Nickel was a photographer in Marceline, obviously. And I picked up a lot of photographs from those days. They are preserved because they were mounted on heavy cardboard. And so they're maintained in relatively good condition typically. And this is one of Walt's playmates, Don Taylor, in Marceline. The Taylor family still lives in Marceline. They had a big influence on Walt. And Walt said that when he lived in Marceline, one of his pals was Doc Sherwood. Doc Sherwood would really dote on Walt. He would brag on his artwork. Walt was always drawing, and Doc Sherwood asked him to draw a picture of Doc's horse, Rupert, which was a Morgan horse, a large draft horse. And Walt did the drawing. And Doc paid him for the drawing, and a light bulb went off in Walt's head at that moment. He said he realized that artwork could not only be fun, it could actually result in an income. So Doc Sherwood also took Walt along on house calls in a one-horse open sleigh. In the wintertime, they used to have a lot more snow then than we get these days. But Walt said we would go just to Helen across the ice and snow behind that Morgan horse in a one-horse open sleigh. Just like the song says, it can be dangerous, but it was a lot of fun. Now, one of the interesting questions that's arisen among Disney scholars is what was Doc Sherwood's first name? Well, a lot of books have given Doc Sherwood various names which are just fictitious. But I'm proud to say that our book is the first and only book so far that lists his true first name. Now, the way I verified that and learned that was through this obituary. The Taylor family maintained a scrapbook from the early part of the 20th century. It was really just a mail order catalog that they had pasted photos and clippings onto. And in that scrapbook, I found Doc Sherwood's obituary. And we knew he didn't die in Marceline. He's not buried anywhere in or near Marceline. This obituary explains that he lived his later years in Winona, and it means Winona, Illinois, a very small town in Illinois. But as you see, even the obituary does not tell us his first name. It only tells us his initial. Well, I figured if I went to Winona, maybe I could locate his tombstone, and I did. And you see here a photograph of the tombstone of Doc Sherwood, and it's beyond dispute that his first name is Leighton. We still don't know his middle name, however. Now, 5 years after Walt and his family moved to Marceline, his father again grew restless, pulled up stakes. He had had an illness and had really never been successful at farming. And so he sold his little farm and moved his family once again on the Santa Fe train to Kansas City. And this is the train station that they almost certainly arrived at in Kansas City, a beautiful Victorian Italianate architecture structure, which no longer stands. And at that time, Kansas City's Union Station was in the West Bottoms area. And as the name suggests, the bottoms are low-lying areas. The bottoms flood, and that's what happened repeatedly. And shortly after the Disney family arrived in Kansas City in 1911, this area flooded again. Well, the railways finally got tired of having their facilities flood, and so they set about to move the headquarters, the Union Station in Kansas City, up to high ground, to where we have it today, to where Union Station is on Pershing, what would be approximately 14th Street, well above the Missouri River, well above the area that floods. But not only did they undertake the construction of one of the most beautiful and one of the largest train stations in the nation, but they had to also, of course, move all of the tracks. And there are a lot of tracks that go all the way through Kansas City, primarily from east to west, but some north and south as well, of course. And moving all of those train tracks was a major undertaking in itself. Walt was always a big fan of trains and rail travel. And indeed, in the first home that the Disney family lived in Kansas City, this 31st Street trolley ran by their house each day. And this is not just a trolley that's similar. This is the trolley. I was happy to find a postcard of it, the trolley that went by their home. But Walt's mother said that she had to keep the curtains drawn on the front room because otherwise the passengers on the trolley could look right into their house. So they moved after approximately 1 year on 31st Street. They moved to a home that's just a few houses off of 31st Street on Bellefontaine Avenue, 3028 Bellefontaine. And this house clearly still stands, and it's largely unchanged from the days that the Walt Disney family lived here. They purchased this home and lived here for roughly 10 years. Of course, the stairs on the left-hand side were added on later, but otherwise it looks very much as it did when the Disney family lived here. You can see on the left-hand side a garage, and that garage and the house are each separately listed on the National Register of Historic Places because they are historic places. In fact, the garage was built by Walt's father, Elias, with Walt's help. And I located an interview with Walt, and he talked about building that and building a bathroom and additional bedroom onto the back of the house. And he said that whenever Elias would get mad at him, he'd throw a hammer or a saw or whatever was handy at him, but he never actually hit him. So I mean, he's pretty clear he didn't intend to hit him. Elias gets a bad rap from a lot of writers. He was thought of as humorless and a strict disciplinarian, but I don't believe he was ever abusive in any way. Walt clearly loved his father and clearly learned a lot from his father, including specifically a very strong work ethic. This is a photo of Walt and his little sister Ruth and his mother Flora, almost certainly during the period that the early years that they lived in Kansas City. And by the way, they did live in Kansas City for twice as long as they lived in Marceline. We don't hear as much about the Kansas City period, but that's what I'm focusing on today, the Kansas City period of Walt's life. Now, I do want to encourage you to go to Marceline if you want to learn and see more of Walt's history. Marceline has a beautiful Walt Disney Museum in the Santa Fe train station, the one that was being built when Walt and his family left town. And make sure that they're open. Call them first and make sure they're open. They have limited hours, but during the summer they're open almost every day. So I highly commend taking a trip to Marceline, about 90 miles northeast of Kansas City. Here we see another image of Walt in Kansas City, obviously playing tennis or maybe badminton. And here we see Walt on the right in his Abraham Lincoln outfit. Now, Walt was always a big fan of Abraham Lincoln, and I think having been born in Illinois, he identified with Lincoln. The young man on the left is a neighbor who lived just a couple of doors away on Bellefontaine, Mr. Walt Pfeiffer. And Walt Pfeiffer and Walt Disney would sneak out at night and go to local movie theaters and vaudeville houses and take part in amateur night contests. And Walt said he once won a quarter in a Charlie Chaplin lookalike contest. And he could not have foreseen at that time that he would later become a personal friend of Charlie Chaplin. And Chaplin and he were mutual admirers of each other's work. But here he's in his Abraham Lincoln outfit on the 12th of February. In 1915, Walt went to school wearing this Lincoln outfit, and he had memorized the Gettysburg Address, and he recited the Gettysburg Address for his class. His teacher was so impressed that she took him to the principal, and the principal was so impressed that he took Walt around to all the classes and asked him to do his Lincoln impression, his Lincoln speech. And Walt loved doing that. He loved performing for people. And he did that for at least a couple of years. And we know that in approximately 1963, the state of Illinois went to Walt Disney and said, we're going to have a pavilion at the New York World's Fair, the 1964-65 New York World's Fair. Would you help us build our pavilion? And Walt said, I certainly will. He said, I'll build you the most lifelike robot that has ever been created. And indeed, that's exactly what he and the Imagineers who worked under him did. They created this figure of Abraham Lincoln, which stood and gestured and his mouth moved in coordination with what the robot was saying. And people had never seen at that time anything like this. They had never seen a mechanical character that was capable of moving and gesturing in such a lifelike manner. And that pavilion was a major hit at the New York World's Fair. Walt, before he ever created this thing, had in mind moving it to Disneyland after the fair, and that's exactly what he did. And so ever since 1966 or so, the Lincoln figure has been performing at Disneyland, at the Opera House in Disneyland. Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln is the show. And in a way, when we see that show today, we're still watching young Walt Disney performing for his classes at the Benton School in Kansas City. Now, in that early period in Kansas City at Benton School, Walt attended his first art classes. And of course, that was very important to him, and he wanted to be an artist. And so his teacher assigned the class one day to draw pictures of flowers, and he drew his flowers with faces on them. And the teacher corrected him, reprimanded him perhaps, and said, "Walt, flowers do not have faces." Well, in 1932, Walt Disney created the first Technicolor animated film, the first film released in full Technicolor, and it was called Flowers and Trees. It became the first animated film to win an Academy Award. And as you can see, in this landmark animated film, the flowers do indeed have faces. There's no doubt that Walt remembered his interactions with his art teacher at Benton School when he created this film. And so he was having a little bit of fun with his teacher from Benton when this was created. And by the way, you know, one of the measures of success in the movie industry, the motion picture industry, of course, is the Academy Awards, which took place now just a couple of weeks ago. And one of the, well, I'll tell you, Leonard Maltin, who many people regard as our greatest film historian and film critic, Leonard Maltin says of Walt Disney that he was the most successful and the most influential producer of films in the history of movie making. Now that is high praise, and Maltin considered his words carefully. I've talked with Leonard a couple of times and gotten his permission to use that quote in some of the articles I've written. But the most successful and the most influential producer in the history of filmmaking was Walt Disney, not just animated films, all filmmaking. And one of the measures of success, of course, again, is the winning an Academy Award. For most people in the film industry, if they win one Academy Award, that is the pinnacle of achievement of their entire career. They are invariably introduced after that as Academy Award winning actor or Academy Award winning director. And so it is a career changing event. Now, a very few actors like Adrian Brody managed to win 2 Academy Awards, but very, very few people in the industry have won more than 2 Academy Awards, except for Walt Disney, who won about 30 Academy Awards during his lifetime for the films that he personally produced and oversaw, more than 30 Oscars. And Walt would frequently go home from the Oscars with an armful of statues. So that is certainly one measure of success. Another is the fact that Walt and his brother were able to hold on to the Disney studio. It was never taken away from them, never bought away from them. Walt did not like the idea of going public and allowing stock to be sold in the company, and he always depended on his brother Roy to deal with the stockholders. Walt's attitude was, if they like what I'm doing, they should buy more stock. If they don't like it, sell that stock. Walt, in Kansas City, also attended art classes at what became the Kansas City Art Institute. And the Art Institute is justifiably proud of its associations with Walt Disney. And indeed, the Disney Company advises young would-be animators that if they want to work in the animation industry, one of the colleges, one of the training locations they should consider is the Kansas City Art Institute. And of course, today it's on a beautiful campus near the Nelson Art Gallery. But when Walt Disney attended classes there, the Art Institute was housed in this building, which also contained the YMCA of Kansas City. Walt also had, now that was when he was 14 years old, he began to attend Saturday morning classes there, and his dad, Elias, paid for them. Apparently, he was a big fan of education. Although he didn't think art was a fit way to make a living, he was in favor of education. So Elias paid for those classes. And later, when Walt operated his studio, he paid for his staff to attend classes at KCAI as well. Now, this is Kansas City Star building, of course, and it was a relatively new structure when Walt Disney began to distribute the Kansas City Star and Times. Elias used the money from the sale of his little farm in Marceline to purchase the right to supervise the distribution of the Kansas City Star and the Kansas City Times from the Star Publishing Company. And it was then housed, as it remains today, at least partially, housed in this very nice building. Walt had to throw those papers every day. Every morning, he said he had to get up at 4:30 in the morning to deliver those newspapers. And his father demanded that the young newsboys who worked under him could not just toss the paper up there. No, they had to fold it and gently put it inside the screen door or the storm door, or in an apartment building, leave it immediately outside the door of each one of the subscribers. Now, if you've seen the film Saving Mr. Banks with Tom Hanks portraying Walt Disney, you recall the conversation between Disney and P.L. Travers, the author of the Mary Poppins books, in which he recounted how hard it was for him to get up early and deliver those newspapers, and how he had to do it no matter what the weather was like. Now, his family did not own a motor vehicle. I don't know why they built a garage, because they never owned a motor vehicle. And indeed, Walt wound up using that little garage for a little studio initially. But Walt said no matter what the weather was like, it could be storming, it could be a blizzard, didn't matter. He had to get out there and deliver those newspapers. And so he would occasionally fall asleep next to the radiators in the apartment buildings, just to catch 40 winks, and then he'd fall asleep and wake up in a panic that he would be late for school, panic that his father would be angry with him for not delivering those papers on time. And so that was something that stayed with him throughout his entire life. Now, there are interesting parallels between Walt Disney's life and Ernest Hemingway's life. They were both about the same age. Hemingway was a couple of years older, but they were born, each of them, very near to the beginning of the 20th century, in or very near to Chicago. Hemingway was born in Oak Park, but it's a suburb of Chicago. Both of these young men moved to Kansas City. Both of these young men worked for the Kansas City Star in different capacities. Hemingway, of course, was a writer for the Star, and he said that the Star and its style book had a great influence on his work. The number one rule at the Star was use short sentences. And of course, that's an example of the principle itself. And so Hemingway tried to abide by what he learned as the rules of a good writing style throughout his entire incredible career. There's both of those young men then joined the Red Cross during World War I. Walt got there and got to France just after the armistice was signed, so he never saw any action. Hemingway, on the other hand, was grievously wounded by shrapnel while driving that Red Cross ambulance. But other than that, they had a very similar experience in their early lives. Well, back to the newspaper delivery. Walt again said that he had to go out there in blizzards. And when we worked on our book for the Star, it occurred to me to investigate how much snow did they really have. Back in 1911, 1912, Walt Disney's first winter in Kansas City, the records, of course, will tell us how much snow there was that year. Maybe he was exaggerating. Maybe it just seemed like a lot of snow because he was a little kid. Well, recently we had some pretty good snows. This was a relatively good winter for this era of global warming and climate change. And so the Kansas City Star recently looked into the question of what are the record snows in Kansas City history. And they tell us that the record to this day for the greatest snow on a single day was in that winter In fact, on March 23rd, so we're not out of the woods yet. We may still see some snow here this year, but 16.1 inches on one day in March of 1912. And indeed, the winter of 1911 to 1912 is still the record holder today for the greatest amount of snow in a single season, the greatest amount of snow in a single month, and as you can see here, the greatest amount of snow in a single day. Well, I have a very special image that I want to share with you that has never been published anywhere else. An image of little 9-year-old Walt Disney trudging through snowdrifts that were taller than he was as he went out to deliver the Kansas City Star and the Kansas City Times. And this is exactly what it looked like. Little 9-year-old Walt trudging through those tall snowdrifts, delivering those newspapers. And at about the same time, Walt's big brother Roy had a job at the First National Bank. And the First National Bank is a beautiful building. Until it seems to me just a few years ago, it was still a bank. But it now is the headquarters for the Kansas City Public Library. And I urge you to visit this building. It is a spectacular building. And the adaptive reuse, the transforming of this bank into a library was done beautifully, masterfully. They did not disturb the original architecture. The bookshelves are freestanding, and this building is just full of wonderful exhibits as well as books and other media. Up on the rooftop, the Missouri Valley Room holds some of the most important historical records of the Kansas City area, and indeed, they have some artifacts there that relate to Walt's time in Kansas City and his many return visits to Kansas City. Also on the roof, right there on the corner in the foreground on the left-hand side, there's a giant chessboard up there in the open air. And the chess piece, each square is about 3 feet square, and the chess pieces are 3 or 4 feet tall, carved wooden chess pieces. So you can actually play a game of chess there if you can lift those chess pieces and move them from one square to another on the chessboard. I also, well, you won't fail to notice the giant brass doors at the front of the building and the giant, I would say at least 14 or maybe 18-inch giant brass knockers. I always think of the line from Young Frankenstein when I go into the bank building. You may recall the Gene Wilder and Terry Garr interaction about knockers. Well, Walt got a job, and again, Roy was always helping Walt with his money. Roy would see that Walt had a dime or a nickel whenever he went into town in Marceline so he could buy some kind of a little toy. And throughout their lives, Roy provided the money for Walt's activities. And Roy found through his connections at the bank that there was an opening at the Van Noy News Agency in probably the summer of 1917. The Van Noy News Agency had contracts with all of the railroads that operated in Union Station in Kansas City. And so when he worked for the Van Noy News Agency, he wore a uniform very much like the conductor's outfit, and he loved wearing that outfit. He would sell to passengers on the trains soda and candy and newspapers. And the boys who did that were known as news butchers. I don't know where the term butcher comes from, but that's what they were called in those days. And the very first day on the job, the train that Walt worked on went to Jefferson City. And this is the Missouri Pacific train station in Jefferson City. The engines in the background there are Union Pacific, and indeed the Missouri combined with other railways to form the Union Pacific later. But the station in Jefferson City still has the earlier name, Missouri Pacific, on it. Now, one of the places that Walt, without a doubt, attended when he was a young boy in Kansas City was Electric Park. Electric Park advertised itself as the Coney Island of Kansas City, and it was indeed. It was a big deal. It had started at another location in the East Bottoms, but for the same reason a train station moved to higher ground, the Heim Brothers Brewing Company created a second electric park on higher ground. In fact, at 46th and Paseo was the location, and it was a spectacular place. It was nicely landscaped. There were gardens, as you can see in this image. it was just a fun place to spend time, and no doubt made a big impression on young Walt Disney. This is the band shell on the left here. John Philip Sousa's marching band played there for the entire summer of 1917. So you know this was a big deal. It was a semi-open air covered performance area. Sousa supposedly said that it had the best acoustics of any place that his band had ever played. And in the foreground, in the center here, this is a fountain. At night, colored lights would come on at the top of this fountain, and water would stream up from the top of the fountain, and young women clad in kind of pseudo-Greek toga outfits would rise up on a platform in the center of the fountain and just stand there. That's all they did. But that was a big attraction. That was a popular feature at Electric Park. And at nighttime, you see here essentially the same image that you just saw, but with the lights on. At nighttime, Electric Park was spectacular. And this was a time when most people didn't even have electricity in their homes. But to come to a place like this where the architecture is outlined with hundreds of thousands of electric lights was an incredible experience. This is another image of the main entrance to the park. What they refer to as a scenic railway is what we would call a roller coaster today. And indeed, the park had multiple roller coasters. It had a log flume ride, very much like the Song of the South ride, which has now been, of course, rethemed to a more politically correct Tiana's Bayou Adventure at Disneyland, at Disney World. But this park had many features that we see today in Disneyland, including lights that come on at dusk and outline all of the architecture. This is a portion of an exhibit at today's Union Station in Kansas City in conjunction with the Walt Disney Company's 100-year exhibit, which just closed there in January. Union Station put on this little display about Electric Park, but frankly, they overstate the role of Electric Park in Walt's design of Disneyland. Now, I think that our book was the first time anyone had suggested that Electric Park had an influence on Walt Disney and his design of Disneyland. But Union Station went on to embellish that further, and they claim that Walt cited Electric Park as his primary inspiration for the design of Disneyland. Well, I'll tell you, that just ain't so, and I wish it were. I would love to believe that. I do believe it had an influence on him. He never cited it as his primary or even his secondary or tertiary inspiration. And I know that because I contacted the Walt Disney Company archivist, Becky Klein, who put this exhibit together. And she didn't realize this signage was there. And she actually had some of her staff research the question, and they found no such thing. So it's interesting how things become embellished and change in the retelling. This is an image of Walt in his Red Cross outfit. He tried to join the military, but he was only 16 years old. None of the military branches would accept him. His big brother Roy had joined the Navy, and he really wanted to get into the war. Now, the family had moved back up to Chicago for just a couple of years, and Walt attended his first and only year of high school during that time up in Chicago. And he finally had heard that the Red Cross would accept boys who were 17. So he took his birth certificate, and he forged is such a harsh word. He fudged his year of birth by turning that 01 into a 0 and making himself 1 year older and managing to get admitted to the Red Cross, even though he was only 16 years old at the time. And his parents reluctantly went along with that and allowed him to do that. So he went up to the Navy Pier and got training, and also went to Connecticut for training with the Red Cross, and then crossed the Atlantic. I believe that Ray Kroc, who later founded McDonald's, was on that same boat, according to some accounts. But Walt's time, again in France, was immediately after the signing of the armistice on 11/11, and so his time there was basically fun. He enjoyed driving that Red Cross ambulance. He acted more as a chauffeur. People weren't getting wounded. There was no battle, no fighting going on any longer. And so he was spared the horrors of trench warfare and the real fighting of World War I. And he spent his time learning to drink, learning to smoke tobacco, which killed him ultimately, and learning to play poker. And he was good at that. And he earned, or at least won, several $100s playing poker, and he sent that money back to his parents in Chicago. When he and his brother Roy both mustered out of the Red Cross and the Navy, they returned initially to Chicago, visited their parents and their little sister Ruth, and they then went back to Kansas City because they regarded Kansas City as their hometown, and that's where their friends were, that's where their connections were. And so they went back to Kansas City. And again, even allowing for the 9 months in Chicago going to high school and the 9 months in France after the war, Disney spent more than 10 years living in Kansas City. So again, Roy hears about a job opening. Well, actually, in this case, Roy heard about a job working for the Pesman Rubin Advertising Agency. That was Walt's first job. While he was there, first job after the war, that is. And while he was there, he met a young man named Ub Iwerks, a man of Dutch descent, who was a very talented artist. And Walt recognized that Ub was actually a better artist than he was. And he and Ub became partners and worked together throughout the remainder of their lives, essentially. Walt saw an ad in the Kansas City Star looking for young artists to work at the Kansas City Slide Company was the initial name of the company. You can see all the women who worked for Mr. Cogger there on the left-hand side and all the young men who worked for him on the right-hand side of this photo. And that's Walt sitting on the pillar, on the right-hand pillar, right next to the boss, right next to Mr. Cogger. Now, everyone who worked for Mr. Cogger loved the man. He apparently had a very outgoing and warm personality, and every record I have been able to find indicates that everyone who worked for him really had a great affection for Arthur Verne Cogger. One of the interesting coincidences is that I became acquainted with Mr. Cogger's son, Ted Cogger, in the course of my Disney obsession and research. And I didn't learn for several months after that Ted was the father of Scott Cogger. Scott Cogger was my friend as an undergraduate at the University of Missouri. We were anti-war activists and student government nerds back in those days, and Scott and I maintained communication, but I had never discussed Disney with him, and he had never mentioned Disney to me. So it was just kind of a neat thing to find that Scott had these associations, that his grandfather had given Walt Disney his first job in the movie business. And that's exactly how Walt put it. And so Scott now is a member of our board of directors working to save the building which housed Walt Disney's first studio. This is another image of the building that Arthur Verne Cogger constructed while Walt worked for him, specifically to be a film production building. And when Walt and Ub went to work for Mr. Cogger, he was in the process of transitioning from making still slides, and thus the name of the company originally, Kansas City Slide Company, transitioning into making animated films. Initially, it was stop motion animation, little paper cutout figures that could be moved and photographed and moved and photographed, and the illusion of motion would come out of that. But Walt knew that the cartoons he saw in the theaters in Kansas City were not made with stop motion. They were made with drawings, and he was an artist, and he wanted to draw animation. And so he did. He and Ub went to the building which then housed the Kansas City Public Library. And you can still see today the names of various great English literature authors just below the gutters on the roof of the building. But this building has also been repurposed very, very well, preserving all of its historic, beautiful historic character. But it's now the headquarters for the Ozark National Life Insurance Company. But all the original signage for the public library is still there, and the names of the authors are still there. And the building is just a really beautiful place. And you can walk in and see the building. You don't have to have business there. They're very nice and very receptive. And this building is immediately east of the federal Courthouse. I believe is at 10th and Cherry Streets. It's very near where Joan Crawford grew up in Kansas City, but that's another lecture. What I found in researching correspondence between Walt and the Kansas City Public Library is that he remembered checking out two books in particular. He and Ub Iwerks checked out these books to teach themselves how to animate drawings. And the books were the two books you see here. These are displayed in an exhibit at the Gene Autry Museum at Griffith Park in Los Angeles. Well, many years back, when I was at the library and found that letter, I thought, wow, well, I wonder if those books might even still be in the collection here. And by golly, one of them was. This book, Animals in Motion by Edward Muybridge. And you can see in the binding in the center there, he has autographed this copy of the book. It's really a treasure. It's been rebound, which is probably why it survived this long. But this is almost certainly the very same copy of this book that Walt Disney checked out to learn to animate drawings back in about 1920. And indeed, what better resource if you want to animate ducks and mice and dogs than a high-speed study of photographs of animals moving. And that's exactly what Muybridge created here. Now, he settled the ancient debate over whether all four of a horse's hooves leave the ground simultaneously when the horse gallops. And the answer is yes, they do. So here's why I believe this to be the very same copy, because it is stamped received by the Kansas City, Missouri Public Library, September 27 of 1917. So unless they had multiple copies, this is the book that Walt Disney learned to animate drawings with, a real holy grail of Disney artifacts. And after I became convinced of this, I went to the library. I had checked the book out for a couple of months and took it back reluctantly and said, for God's sake, don't let anyone else check out this book. I gave them a new copy of Animals in Motion and said, look, put this one on the shelves, put that other one in a vault, and don't let anybody get their hands on it. And indeed, the library now recognizes the importance of that book. Now, here's young Ub Iwerks on a postcard that I discovered at a postcard show, and his father, who soon after abandoned the family. Ub did not have warm feelings for his father, but indeed, his father was also a professional photographer. So in many ways, Ub grew up to be like his father. Ub was not only regarded as the world's greatest and fastest animator, and many people regard him as the co-creator of Mickey Mouse, but Ub also won Academy Awards for his creation of special cameras and special effects technology. Now, Mr. Cogger knew that the silver nitrate film that movies were printed on in those days was extremely flammable, virtually explosive. And he foresaw that some of that film might catch fire, and it did. And here we see dozens of people being entertained by a fire at the Kansas City Slide Company, or Kansas City Film Ad Company, as he changed the name. But the fire was contained in the vaults that Mr. Cogger built for exactly that reason, and he was able to clean it up, and the building was not lost. In fact, it still stood till just a few years ago when the University of Missouri purchased that building, and despite our pleas, tore it down. But because of our pleas, they did save an important artifact for us. I'll show you in just a minute. But this is on the left-hand side here. This is Walt Disney with a pipe in his teeth and a visor on his head, drawing for Mr. Cogger. And here is the bone that they threw us, the Kansas City Slide Company sign. These are 3 slabs, about 3 by 3 feet and a foot thick, and these were preserved and saved. So I do want to give MU credit for that. And they gave them to us, and these will be exhibited in the Laugh-O-Gram Studio building when it's finally fully restored. This is Mr. Cogger, Arthur Vern Cogger, who had a big influence on Walt Disney. These are the slides that the company manufactured, hand-drawn and hand-tinted slides that are still available, and I've collected several dozen of the ones from the Kansas City Slide Company. And I can't say that Walt Disney drew this one, or this one, or this one, but it's possible. And these are the types of slides that he created when he worked for Mr. Cogger. But soon after, he decided he worked in his dad's garage with a camera that Mr. Cogger loaned him, and he decided he knew how to make animated cartoons. He left Mr. Cogger's employ and opened up the Laugh-O-Gram studio in this building at 31st and Forest Streets, about a block east of Troost. It still stands, but it was very close to being demolished when we bought this building just about 30 years ago. Now, Walt's Laugh-O-Gram studio was on the second floor toward the west end. So those three sets of windows were where the Laugh-O-Gram studio was located. This is the building recently. It's a mixed blessing that it's in a neighborhood which has been somewhat depressed, because if it were in a nice neighborhood, it might have been torn down and replaced, certainly would have been remodeled. But the building still stood. It was scheduled to be demolished by the city of Kansas City, and we begged them not to, and they agreed, and they knew that they wanted us to succeed in saving this building. Then Mayor Emanuel Cleaver in particular and Dick Berkeley were very supportive of our work. The city, however, said that this section that's missing here had bowed outward and was dangerous, and so they required us to disassemble and then reassemble the same bricks, put them back in the same place, and meanwhile we had to put these 3-ton blocks of concrete on the sidewalk with flying buttresses to hold the walls in place while we reconstructed that wall. And today, here's how the building looks. These are brand new windows on the second story. They are virtually identical in appearance, but they're much more insulating than the originals. We've reconstructed this column on the left-hand side. An allegedly drunk woman in a Dodge Charger crashed into that a couple of summers ago, but we were able to repair that damage. And we also have the leaded glass panels, which were in above each of the windows, and those will be restored. And that building was designed by Nell Peters, an independent female architect in the 1920s who designed more than 400 commercial buildings in Kansas City, and her work is very highly regarded. She also designed 2 buildings which still stand in Columbia, 2 apartment houses, the Belvedere and the Dumas. Now here's a wire wastebasket, and I know I'm getting close to my time here, but this was just like the wire wastebasket in Walt's studio. And Walt not only worked in the Laugh-O-Gram studio, he lived there. He said, I don't need an apartment. I don't do anything but sleep there. I can sleep in my studio. So he lived and worked in his studio. At night, he said mice would come out to take the crumbs from his employees' lunches out of a wire wastebasket. He would watch them, and he began to put food out for them, and he began to draw them closer to him. He said one little mouse was tamer and braver than the others, and he tamed that mouse, and it became his pet. And Walt said in multiple interviews with major magazines in the early 30s that that little mouse, which lived in a drawer of this desk on the left-hand side, and I'm sitting at that desk right now, that the mouse lived in a drawer of his desk. And indeed, 5 years later, when Walt needed to create a new character, it was that mouse that inspired the creation of Mickey, perhaps the world's most famous fictional character. The movies they made, you can see 2 of the one-sheet posters for them, were very similar to what Walt created for the rest of his career. Movies loosely based on classic children's stories and fairy tales. And you might note also that Walt was a member of the South Central Business Association. When he came back to Kansas City years later, he met with his old pals at the SCBA. This is one of the title cards and the continuing characters in his silent black and white Laugh-O-Gram cartoons that he made in Kansas City, several of which still exist, several of which we will show in our building when it's completed. Julius the cat on the left-hand, or rather the right-hand side from our point of view, was his first continuing character. And Julius the cat continues to be recognized at Disneyland. There's a place at the Disney California Adventure Park called Julius Cat's Clothiers, and that's clearly a tribute to Julius the cat. Here's how the building looked when we acquired it. Some friends of mine and I put in a little money, got a good deal on that building because we took the risk the city would still tear it down and bill us for hauling it away. But they held off, and ultimately we've been able to save it. Joan Crawford may have worked with Walt in Kansas City briefly. She also attended a semester at Stevens College in Columbia. And I probably better stop here. I don't want to run over my time. I'll be happy to respond to questions. This was a sheet music that Walt did a music video for. And this is an image of Walt on the roof of our building about to clobber one of his staff with a .45 automatic while he appears to be filmed by other members of his staff. Stacia, are there any questions that folks have?
Yeah,
Or
Dan, we have a couple of questions. Richard wants to know, did Walt also visit the Fairmont Park to the east of Kansas City when it operated? It was built by Arthur Stillwell in
Mhm.
1892 and lasted as an amusement park, picnic grounds until the 1930s.
Yes, yes. Fairmont Park was a very interesting place. Not as big as Electric Park, but exactly as the questioner says, Arthur Stillwell was quite a character. Arthur claimed to have visions and dreams, and he built the Kansas City Southern Railway. And a room at Union Station now is the Arthur Stillwell room. For that reason, I gave a Disney talk there a few months back. I think the answer is yes. I know at least one biography credits Fairmont Park with being Walt's influence, and indeed, I think it probably played a role. And there were several other parks that Walt visited in the early 1950s specifically to get ideas for his new theme park. So the answer is, I think so. I think that Fairmont Park was probably also one of the places that Walt certainly visited and almost certainly had some influence on his design for Disneyland. But Electric Park resembles Disneyland much more than Fairmont.
Okay, and David says, Mortimer, question mark,
Yeah.
was Mickey born in Kansas City? What's the official line?
Well, no, Mickey wasn't born in Kansas City, but he was inspired by, again, the pet mouse that Walt said he kept in his studio. Um, Mortimer was the initial name, as Walt told the story. Some people think Walt made this up, but I don't think so. He didn't generally make things up. His story about trudging through snowdrifts, he didn't make that up. It turned out he was telling the truth about that. And I think he's telling the truth when he talks about the origin of Mickey. Walt's initial character, and on March 26th, I'll tell more about this, but his initial animated character, the last film he made in Kansas City and his first series in Hollywood, was the Alice comedies. After that, he had a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit that he made for Universal Studios, but Oswald was stolen from him, in Walt's view, by his distributor's husband, who Walt didn't have a lawyer review his contract. Walt didn't read the contract very closely himself, apparently, and he didn't realize that his distributor owned the rights to Oswald. And so Walt left a very contentious meeting in New York City, wherein he said essentially, "You can keep Oswald." He may have used more colorful terminology when he talked to Charlie Mintz about Oswald, but he said, "You can keep Oswald." And Mintz had gone behind his back and hired away almost all of his staff, except for Ub Iwerks. All of Walt's staff had agreed to go to work for Charles Mintz. Walt said, "You can keep all those guys too." And on the way back, and in one account at least, while traveling through Illinois and Missouri, Walt and his wife Lillian came up with the idea of a mouse character. And Walt said that he initially wanted to name it Mortimer, but that Lillian didn't think that was a very good name, and that she suggested Mickey instead, and Walt agreed and named the character Mickey. Now, whether there was any more to Mortimer or not is debatable. I know that there is one account that seems to suggest that there was actually a Mortimer. Now, later in the Mickey cartoons, indeed, a mouse character, a rat character, I think, really a tall, slender, smarmy character who was Mickey's rival for Minnie's hand, was called Mortimer. So there was eventually a Mortimer mouse character in the Disney films, but he only appeared once or twice. I don't believe Mortimer or Mickey were actually created in Kansas City, although Walt's early Laugh-O-Gram films do feature mice. There are many M-A-N-Y, not many M-I-N-N-I-E, but there are many mice in Walt's Laugh-O-Gram cartoons, which were made in Kansas City. But they don't resemble Mickey, they don't talk, and they don't play a major role. So I don't believe we have any solid evidence of a Mortimer character being created in Kansas City. Wish we did.
I think we'll just take one more question.
Mhm.
How did you acquire Walt's desk?
Well, thank you for asking. We got a letter last year from a gentleman who said that his father had worked in the Laffergram building for the Cook Paint and Varnish Company, and that his father had acquired what he described as one of the two desks on which Mickey Mouse was created. Well, again, it's a little bit of an embellishment, a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think it is quite likely that this desk I'm sitting at right now is indeed the desk pictured in the image I showed you of the interior of the Laffergram studio. It's almost identical. I think this desk has been stripped and refinished and is now a blonde rather than a dark oak color as the desk appears in the photograph. But it is in almost every other detail virtually identical to the desk in that image. So I went to that gentleman's daughter's home, and they wanted this desk to be back at the Laffergram building, and that's where it will be when we finish restoring the Laffergram building. By the way, we got a $2 million grant just a little over a year ago due to the efforts of former Kansas City Mayor Emanuel Cleaver, now Congressman Emanuel Cleaver. He saw the opportunity to acquire some money for our project. He called us up and said, could you guys use a couple $1 million? And we thought about it for a second and said, yes, we could use a couple $1 million. And so we now finally are really on our way to doing serious restoration, not just preservation, but restoration of that building. We will restore to the best of our ability the Disney studio, Laffergram studio area as close as we can to the way it appeared. We have other photos of the interior of that studio, and it actually appears in Walt's last film in Kansas City. We're really excited about the progress we're making, but we've got a long way to go. If you go to thankyouwaltdisney.org, please do go to thankyouwaltdisney.org. Go to our website, and you can see a moving three-dimensional image of how our building will be restored, how those studio rooms will be restored, and the historic exhibits that will be part of the new facility in the Laffergram building.
Great. Okay, well, we're out of time and we appreciate all of your questions. Thank you for being with us today, Dan. There's a lot of material to cover here, so we hope it left you wanting more. Dan will be back with part 2 of Disney of Kansas City on March 26th at 11 a.m. So we'll see you in 2 weeks.